That's working.
Yeah,
Great. Thank you.
amazing.
Hello, everyone. My name's Clay Harrison. I'm director at Whitby Wood. We're structural engineers and also executive engineers on the Phoenix, which we'll explain a bit more about in a while. But yeah, I'll be quiet for the first part and let Andy from nature talk a bit more.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm Andy Tugby. I'm head of sustainable construction for Human Nature, and I'll tell you a bit more about Human Nature in just a minute. I apologise because Kelly's controlling the screen now, so I'm going to have to ask her to switch slides. So apologise for the kind of clunkiness of that process. But so Human Nature. Go on then. No, that's fine. It's fine. Just no, either or, Kelly. That's fine. Thanks. So Human Nature, so Human Nature is a property development company, but I always feel a bit like I'm at an AA meeting when I say that. My name's Andy Tugby, and I'm a property developer. It feels like I've got something to feel guilty about. But the reason for that is so the roots of Human Nature is that the two CEOs of Human Nature, or the CEO and the chairman, have previously been the CEOs of Greenpeace UK and Greenpeace Canada. So the background of the company in itself is from a place of kind of campaigning and environmentalism and sustainability. Uh, from years of working in the industry, as I'm sure lots of you have experienced, we've individually, before we became a company, lots of the people that work in the building individually, we've worked on countless projects where we've been engaged to have some input to improve the sustainability of a project in one way or another. And you spend a lot of your time and energy putting your heart and soul into creating something that's really meaningful, that makes a difference to the project. And the first thing that happens when there's any sort of cost issue is that those are the first things that get value engineered out, and the scheme ends up being another ordinary, normal, traditional scheme that doesn't have any of the sustainability benefits that it could have. And after years and years of going through that, the realization was from Jonathan Smales and Michael Manelson, the two ex-Greenpeace CEOs, was that the only way to really make a difference in the sector is to be the client, is to be the developer. So Human Nature was born out of a desire to have a positive impact on development, and what that means is that we're often a developer will do sustainable things because it ticks another box, it creates another outcome for them. We look at it from the other direction. We look at development as a way of creating sustainable outcomes. So it's our method for delivering sustainable change. Because as we all know, there's a climate emergency, a housing crisis, cost of living crisis, mental health crisis, all sorts of crises. And we need to do something differently. And there's no place, as we think, for business as usual in any of this. So it's just kind of, so we feel like, so as I said, the most effective way is to be the client, but the difficult thing is to hold your course. I mean, we were just discussing before the call how kind of challenging it is to make some of these commitments, but even more challenging to keep them. But Kelly, can you go to the next slide, please? But we have no choice. We think there's no we've got no right. We as a company, we don't think we've got any right to build anything unless we follow these rules and these commitments, because we'll just make, we'll be in a place where we're making things worse, where what we actually want to do is have an impact that makes things better and is actually regenerative, rather than the built environment being just destructive. And how do we do that? So we've developed what we call the circle of impact. So it's a kind of I'm going to read this out. It's a bespoke framework for strategy planning, design, setting, measuring, monitoring, and learning to achieve regenerative impacts. And how can just flip to the next one, please, Kelly. So there are these 12 levers of change. We think that if you I won't go through them because it's that would be really boring. But these 12 levers of change that we feel that if you pull all of those levers, then you can make a really impact. You can really impact the sustainability of the place that you're creating. But the key to this is that these are all linked to place, and by developing to a certain scale. So the Phoenix, as we'll talk about in a minute, is a neighborhood scale, and at that scale it allows you to do more, and it allows you to impact more of these levers. So some of them are really obvious on those levers. So sustainable mobility, buildings and fabric are obvious, but some of them are less so. Things like catalytic conversations. I mean, what does that mean? The idea of a catalytic conversation is that if you design a place where people just live in a more sustainable way, then when people come to visit, they'll talk about what they do as if it's just normal. So it's normal to have a smaller apartment but have a shared space in the on the ground floor. It's normal to not have a washing machine anymore. You have a shared laundrette where you actually meet people and speak and you interact with your neighbors. It's normal to not own a car. It's normal to be part of a car club that's really effective and easy to use, and that conversation becomes catalytic because it gets taken away from the wherever the conversation is had, and it becomes another conversation somewhere else. And in that way, in the middle, this idea of exponential sustainability, it's an idea that comes from John Elkington's book Green Swans. The idea that sustainability needs to be exponential. It needs to build upon itself as it spreads outwards in order to have the effect that's needed for there to be the impact that's required to make the change that's required. We also think that if we pull all these 5 levers and we can develop places that meet all of these elements of the circle of impacts, then it's what you end up with is not something. There's a common misconception with sustainability that in order to live a more sustainable lifestyle, you have to give something up, you have to do without, you have to live less, you have to live in some sort of lack. But we believe that if we really pull all these levers and we create a place that meets all of these elements, then what you end up with is better. It's more fulfilling. It's a more wholesome and altogether more rewarding way to live. Please, Kevin. So moving on to the Phoenix. So the Phoenix is a project in Lewes. It's our first project as a company altogether. It's a 7.9 hectare brownfield site within the South Downs National Park. I could do a whole presentation on dealing with the national park, but and they were wonderful, in case there's any members of the national park on the call. But with so it's within the bounds of Lewes, and here's the picture of the site itself seen from the air. So as you can see, it's an industrial site, predominantly steel framed industrial sheds with some historic buildings. I say historic buildings, some buildings with history, not technically historic buildings. But Lewes, everyone thinks of Lewes as a kind of sleepy market town. Please, Kelly, if you just go to the next one. But you'll see from this picture from 1923, Lewes is anything but market towny this is 100 and something years ago. So it was actually quite an industrial place with quite heavy industry. So if we look at the next slide, you can see that. So the site itself was the Phoenix Ironworks. So it was like proper heavy industry. You could be excused looking at the previous picture to think you were looking down on a town in Yorkshire, but actually it's the sleepy market town of Lewes. So but the site itself, like I say, was an ironworks. And if we go to the next, and you can see some of so these are photos from inside. So this and the next, or sorry, this photo from inside inside one of the buildings that we've got. That we're keeping the structure of, that we'll reuse the structure. That structure is all there, and there's old-fashioned sand casting of iron columns. And on the next slide, we see that some of the the next slide. So some of the decorative ironwork you'll see at train stations, and in the next slide, the piers of the south coast. A lot of that ironwork was actually made in the foundries on site at the Phoenix. So there's loads of history and loads of stuff which we have to respect, and we will endeavour to honour that tradition and that history through the development. But what we see on the next slide is the state of the site as it is at the moment. So it's relatively derelict. I mean, a lot of the buildings are still occupied by people on really low rent who've got businesses that are struggling to hang on. There's a whole load of issues around that, which I won't go into either. But we are trying to rehouse as many of those as possible with sort of meanwhile uses and within creative reuse of the spaces as we build through the development, and with final housing for some of them if we can make that work. But generally the buildings themselves are in reasonable condition. I mean, this one's in shit state, but most of them in reasonable condition. They've all got asbestos roofs. It's all steel frame, and I think Kelly's going to talk a little bit about material reuse. So one of our key strategies is that we won't demolish anything. we'll dismantle everything. We've already started to investigate. We've got a materials audit done of the site, so we know how much and what size steel section we've got. We know how much brick we've got. We know how much crushed material we're likely to have, and that forms a key strategy of how we deal with the project as we make a start on things. Just before we move on to the actual project itself, one of the things that is particular about Lewes is that Lewes is quite a strong, is a town of opinions, shall we say? It's got a group for everything, and we did more public engagement, I think, than any developer in the history of development has done, and we engaged with every group and multiple times, and we did it at an early enough stage that we could actually listen to them and actually take their opinions on board, and that had a massive effect on the town, we think. And generally, the site had a previous planning permission for a similar size scheme, slightly fewer number of dwellings. Not a great scheme, if I'm honest, and the town hated it. They had whole movements started to shut down the development. They had a carnival, they had a street procession to stop the development. But if we pop to the next slide, this is the scene outside the planning committee when the Phoenix development went to committee. There were about 60 people outside demonstrating to say yes to our development. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I've never seen that before. That's not a thing that you see often. And so one of the things that we do, and I'll go on to a bit more talk about this a little bit more, is that we believe in kind of early engagement in its fullest extent. So that's early engagement with the community, with stakeholders, with consultants, with with all interested parties, and this image here is one of the payoffs of that sort of early engagement. But on the next slide, we can see, so this is the plan of what the master plan that we've kind of come up with at Phoenix. The key driver to this is the idea of placemaking. So obviously there are requirements of there are financial requirements of certain volume of housing to be required. There's infrastructure requirements, but the key driver is to do with placemaking and connection with the town itself. So just some key facts about the site. There's 685 homes, 30% of which are affordable, 600 meters of river frontage, 100% renewable energy delivered through on and off site measures, district heat network from open loop ground source heat pumps. We think there'll be training and skills for young people. There'll be 500 construction jobs thereabouts, 380 permanent jobs thereabouts once the scheme's up and running. Food growing, shared spaces, and co-mobility services, so that we can enable low car ownership. So a co-mobility hub, which is located on the edge of the site, that will have an EV car club and an EV car hire last mile delivery service, sufficient that we only need to provide one parking space for every 7 dwellings, plus some blue badge parking on site. So it's not a car-free neighborhood. It's a low traffic neighborhood. The expectation is that the streets will be inhabited by people walking and bikes and wheelchairs and occasional blue badge cars and the odd large delivery. But mostly it'll be a place where you would feel safe and comfortable, and you'd feel like the street is yours, not it doesn't belong to the bin lorry. So Kelly, next one, please, if you don't mind. So as I started to mention before, one of the things that we believe in is this concept of deep collaboration, and that means that we collect around us. I mean, we're quite experienced in our team, but what experience we don't have, we make up with our wider team, and we've got quite a stellar group of engineers and architects and contractors already that have been involved in the process. I won't go through the list, but we pick out some highlights. There are various prize-winning architects, it's fabulous engineers, circular economy experts, planning experts. Obviously, Whitby Wood are in there as executive engineers. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we really believe in is this concept of deep collaboration. So you get everyone that you can in the room as early as possible and as many times as you can afford within the scheme. It's an expensive process. Obviously, you're having to pay all these like top class consultants and architects and engineers to be at all day workshops where you thrash through some of the key ideas. But we firmly believe that the result that you get from that and it is better, and also it makes the whole process more efficient. So it probably pays for itself in the long run, we think. Okay. Yeah, it's a hard thing to quantify, but we don't think our professional fees are any higher than you would normally expect on a project of this scale because of doing things this way. But we do think that the outcomes have benefited from it. So, and so here is some of the images that you might have seen of the project. So just to give a quick overview, so we're committed to building sustainably. I won't go into that too much because Kelly will talk a little bit about that. Because as I've said, we either build things well and we build responsibly, or we don't build at all, and it's as simple as that for us. And as I said before, being the client, being the developer means that we can ensure that that happens, because it's us that makes those decisions, and it's us that has to hold fast when the cost consultant is saying you can't do that. And we have to, and if something has to give, it has to be something else. It has to not be where. So we're committed to building in timber as much as we can. Again, I won't go into that too much, but we're looking at the embodied carbon and material efficiency as two of our key drivers, if you like, for when we look at design. Where interestingly, in terms of operational energy, we don't meet net zero. There you go. There's a surprise for everyone, but maybe not. But when for some of you, this will be obvious. But when you're building at scale like this, at a density like this, it's quite difficult to meet your electrical demands with purely on-roof PV. So we've maximized the on-roof PV as much as we can, but it doesn't meet all the demand, the requirements. We've got an agreement with a massive solar farm, which is 9 miles away, but that doesn't count in the eyes of the planners. So we don't technically meet net zero. But I'll show you a graph a bit later on that shows why we think that's not that important in this context. But Kelly, if you can just flick to the next, I'll hurry up now because I'm taking up quite a lot of your time. So just to very quickly just talk about the idea of the buildings is that there's a lot of shared space and communal spaces. All of the courtyards are also rain gardens, so the sustainable drainage is accounted for within spaces that the people want to inhabit and create this sense of conviviality and wanting to share spaces with people and to know your neighbours. So if you just flick through the next couple, please. And there's a view from the sky, looking down on that, and then and the next one, Kelly, if you flick to that. And so the idea is that because what we're doing, as I mentioned briefly before, is because we're building at the scale of a neighborhood that allows us to do things that ordinarily with a single building or a couple of buildings you can't necessarily do. So the scale of this town square, for instance, that we're creating is something that a development of a smaller scale probably wouldn't stand for that level of open space and public realm to be left and given over. But we think it's so important to the creation of place and to foster the connection with the river and the connection with nature that is needed in order to pull some of those other levers of change that we talked about before. Kelly, please. And I talked a little bit about building. So I won't steal Kelly's thunder at all. But one of the things that we're going to focus on, and one of the key measures that has allowed us to will allow us to ensure that the principles of sustainability find their way through into the construction of the buildings is by the what we call the build and design playbook, which is the key part that Kelly's going to talk about. but it's basically it's a framework. It sets out the principles that kind of to maximize resource efficiency and minimize embodied carbon in a building or in a structure of any kind. And it's a really key part of how we do this, and where we're working on the Phoenix project at the moment. We have got other projects in the pipeline, and for each project, parts of the playbook that we've already got will be relevant, and for some other projects, the housing typology will require its own playbook, but everything will have that same principle. Every project we do will have that same principle running through it, because that's the only way that we feel, or the best way that we feel, that you can guarantee that the principles that are required for embodied carbon see their way through. And if we just finish on the last slide, oh, it's not finished, but if we go to the last slide. So this is, I was going to tell you about the impact of operational energy versus embodied carbon. So just to show, I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but the operational energy, if you look at the graph in the middle, so you can see conventional, if we imagine conventional is net zero, that's why there's no dots there. We've got a few little dots there. Each dot is 500 kilos of carbon, I think. So you can see the impact of us spending a little bit of carbon on the operational carbon. Interesting though as well, that one of the reasons we don't meet operational carbon net zero is because we refuse to accept that when you look at unregulated loads, that you can assume that best practice on unregulated loads, because if they're unregulated, you can't regulate them, you can't promise what they're going to be. So you should, we think, assume worst case scenario of what people will use when you let them loose in a house. And so our calculations are based on worst case scenario unregulated loads, because we can't promise that it will be otherwise. That's an aside. It's another little bugbear of mine. But you can see the comparison of that, if you look at the same scale for embodied carbon, so our buildings are regenerative. If you account for sequestering, they're regenerative. But the comparison of conventional build against what we're planning, you can see the scale of carbon emission savings there. But then when you look at transport, you see that the scale of emissions from transport knocks the others into a cocked hat, as they say. So I won't dwell on that anymore. I'm gonna, if you flip to the next slide, Kelly, I think that's me. I'm handing over to the smart one in the room.
Thank you, Andy. I'm not sure I can live up to that, but I'll take it. Thanks a lot. I'm just gonna hone in now on the build and design elements. So like how have we gone from the beginning of the project to ensuring that what we're building here does meet the expectations and aspirations of human nature. And hopefully it will change to the next slide for me. Hang on. No.
Do you want me to do it for you?
Got it. Thank you. So we're looking at the site here on plan on the left. And the way that human nature approached this was, first off, we were getting detailed planning permission for one parcel of the development. So I think there's around 650-ish new homes across the site. Parcel 1 up, which is in the blue square there up the top, about 49 of those. And they're ones that we took to a more detailed design stage with a full team. And then learned lessons through that process that we could then apply to the build and design playbook for the rest of the development. So the idea is this build and design playbook is a kind of a set of guidelines or ways of approaching the design across the whole master plan to ensure that we don't lose those low embodied carbon aspirations through value engineering or design decisions or risk averseness, and that we are aware of all of the issues that might come up from the very start, and we speak to the right people at the right times along the way. And so we've got a couple of really beautiful images on the right there of the parcel 1, which Ash Sakula are the architects for. And so what was our brief? The brief from Human Nature was that we these residences need to be built from timber. They need to be as much as possible of that timber should be sourced locally, and we should be having a building design philosophy. So everything that is proposed should be buildable and should be buildable in in a way that is we've avoided as many risks as possible. So we've got a little, I'm sure lots of you have seen this diagram before, but the reducing environmental impact at the top there. So our first port of call is reuse. As Andy said, we reuse all of the materials on the site. So we have a fantastic materials audit, so we know exactly what we've got and what's appropriate where. We then look at material selection, and so looking through the reuse, we are able to reuse a lot of the brickwork, the steelwork, but there's a lot of buildings here that need to be formed in certain ways, and so the new residences and houses are proposed in the most part to be built from a material selection part of that diagram, which is the lowest embodied carbon possible for this site. And we found that to be timber, or human nature found that to be timber. And so we've made sure that we can do that from the beginning. And then we need to make sure that that timber is designed in a lean way without waste or, in any sort of, we're using all of the material in the most efficient place and in the most efficient way. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we looked at that in a moment. And then specification. So how, if we know we have to use some concrete in some parts of the book, how can we really drill into that and get that specification as good as it possibly can be to meet our embodied carbon targets. That's what we really base the whole process on. So a little bit of that reuse. We talked about the materials above ground already, and we hope to use a lot of those in the community buildings planned and across the master plan and in public spaces. But perhaps the residences themselves will be built by more standardized timber panelized low carbon solutions. But we also have a whole load of existing foundations in the ground. We're right next to a river, and so we've not got the best ground. It's alluvial. And your normal approach to a project like this might be, oh, we need very deep piles everywhere. And yes, we probably do need some piles in some parts of the site. But also there's buildings there that already have piled solutions. And we found the records of those. And perhaps we can use a slightly more innovative way of looking at the foundation design and the strength of the existing soil rather than just looking at the soil properties, but also looking at what consolidation and additional strength do the piles already in the ground give us, and enable us to reduce what we need on our proposed piles or proposed foundation solutions. So that's something we're really drilling into as we go through the process, and that's something in the playbook that is highlighted as what the way that the master plan should be approached across the board. So here, just looking a little bit on how you might do some of that ground improvement and how as well we might have to interact with the structures for the flood defences, which expedition engineering have been designing and obviously very integral to the whole scheme working as well. So we've done a lot of work around that and setting out some rules and interfaces and how we best approach that to give the most materially efficient solution. And we also talked about crushed material earlier, and we know how much of that we will have, and perhaps that could be used in some of these ground improvement approaches as well. And so then going on to looking at the residences, so those 49 that we looked at in parcel 1, there's a couple of rough little sketches here, but we looked, first of all, we were thinking how these need to be buildable, they need to be standardized, but they also need to meet another one of human nature's core philosophies, which is they're called raw and craft. And so raw and craft is that we have as open and free space as possible. We don't want to be designing houses or residential units that are so constrained by the structure that they can only have fixtures and fittings in certain areas. It wants to be adaptable, have a long life, and also we don't really want to be putting lots of fixtures and fittings in there that somebody's just going to come in and take out again. We'd rather maximize on that and make sure that whoever's moving into the property puts what they want into the property first time round, so we're not having any wastage of materials in doing that. And so we really started looking at the start of how we're going to stabilize these blocks, the residence blocks. Are we going to look at each terrace individually, and therefore that restricts how much that requires a certain amount of structure, which might restrict the number of window openings, or might need additional walls inside the building, which might limit that raw and craft philosophy? Or can we be a bit more sensible about this and look at the whole terrace as a whole, as a whole unit? So we looked, can we do it across all buildings, or should we look at it with just the end units? And I'll talk a little bit more about the embodied carbon approach to these terraces as well later. But what we found is in looking at the embodied carbon as well, the most efficient way we felt for parcel one in any case, it was to use engineered timber for the end blocks, which are quite a little bit different architecturally from the others, which are more standardized, and use, because that's so strong and structurally efficient, and use that to create the stability, or provide the stability for the whole block. And then the houses or duplexes in between can be built extremely material efficiency just for vertical loads, and have the flexibility to be as open as possible, have as many windows as they want, and in as many different sort of, for architectural interest, on the front and rear facades. And so that was the strategy we decided was best for parcel one. And so describing that in the playbook, and that process of decision making is hopefully going to influence other parcels in future to think along similar lines, or at least go through the same decision making process. So also we looked at standardization. So really a bit more explanation there on what I've just mentioned. Looking at those the units, we don't really want a very uniform standardized architectural approach, because we were creating beautiful sustainable neighborhoods here where people want to live and want to interact, and so that's just as important as the build system as well. And so we felt that using the party walls between and the engineered timber for the stability gave us a real opportunity, and be able to have variation in the facades in locations, and how the different units might be laid out. We do have a couple of typologies. So there's a wedge type and a rectangular type, and then Ash Sackler looked at how they arrange those so that we could still have standardization of panels of the timber build, but create the versatility and variety we want in the architecture of the area, of the parcel. And then we looked at sort of the slightly standardizable elements, such as where we want to reset back for balconies and external space, which is obviously super necessary for health and well-being, and also and light and all those things, and also the end mansard walls, which will also want to have openings, but as well as being sort of load-bearing elements. And then also staircases, and how we get the best arrangement of those within the units but still working with standardized floor panelization units. And so we looked at the typical terraces, and there was a design done at early stages, assuming the whole thing would be cross-laminated timber, which is engineered timber, comes in from Europe. And then we also had a look to see a similar unit, what that would be if it was a timber joisted, timber stud construction with a sort of potentially a hemp insulation or a natural fiber insulation between. And so we could see through there's two scores, little diagrams there on the left. The CLT was doing great. It gave us an A rating, better than the Letty targets, etc. But we are able to reduce that by a good 30% to get to an A+ by using a timber frame system. And so by concentrating using the engineered timber in the more complex units that provide stability to the whole block, we felt that's a much more efficient way to use that embodied carbon. And so we then really dug into one of the more complicated end blocks, which you can see a Revit model there on the right-hand side. We found that there we're better than the Letty target, but we're actually at a B with that. But that doesn't count sequestered carbon. It's just looking at embodied carbon, so that's the emissions that's emitted at the start. And because it's doing such a good job for all the rest of the units, which are at an A+ across the whole scheme, that balances out quite nicely. And then we also have done quite an in-depth look at which exact elements are using all of that carbon. A big part of is the walls, and so we know exactly in the next design stages where to target our efforts to really hone that in and get it lower and lower, which is the whole system behind the playbook. And so going through that design of parcel 1, we really could have a look and dig into what the barriers were going to be. So one of our briefing points was also how much of this timber can we source in Sussex? So we had a great contact with Sussex Forestry to really understand how much timber there was, how it gets graded, can it be used structurally, what's the time frame in getting it felled, dried out, graded, fabricated, made into panels, and built on our site. We created quite a large cutting list to see, based on our parcel 1 design of timber studs, stud walls, how much timber would we need across the entire master plan. And so we've been looking to see if that's actually possible. One thing we found is there isn't actually the sort of processing facilities in Sussex at the moment, and so they would have to go out of Sussex to be processed and brought back again. Whether there's an opportunity there to say, hang on, we use Sussex timber anyway, and maybe that encourages someone to come and invest in that processing apparatus or facility, that would be fantastic. Also, there's probably enough timber in the development that isn't structural, that is used for skirtings, banisters, floorboards, all of those sorts of things that would easily use the capacity of Sussex timber as well. And so perhaps that's a better use of the local timber than using a structural product at this stage. And so that's something that in our sort of decision-making framework, we will be working through in the next stages. We also really, insurance is a big thing here, and the biggest issue really is the flood resilience and the flood defences that we found. Obviously, there are fire issues and there are water ingress just from rain, etc., and leaky pipes and things. But there's quite well documented ways of dealing with all of that, especially at this scale, under 4 stories. There's lots of typical details. There's lots of examples of warranties being given, and there are ways to design to deal with those risks. And as long as you have those conversations with the insurers really early in the design stage, and you say, these are the risks we've identified, these are the ways we're going to tackle them throughout the design, and you check in with them along the design process, then they've got confidence in you as a design team and a client, and they know that you know what you're doing, and they're able to deal with it. But the flood resilience is a really probably going to be the big one to deal with, and so we've got several options going forward of whether we use sort of recycled bricks or remade bricks for up to the flood defense level, and then a timber frame on top of that, and other possible options and other ways of arranging the flood defenses to deal with those issues. And so there's another set of decision-making guidelines around that. And so also we proposed from the start, and similar way to CDM regulations, we have a sustainability risk register. So with the rest of the design team, we sort of looked at what are all the amazing sustainable solutions or systems that we're proposing here, and what are the risks to them being designed out or costed out at a later stage of the program. And so we created this sustainability risk register and assigned actions by various people in that, and that's something that we plan to check in throughout the design stages of each parcel to make sure that those risks are being fully thought about and the barriers identified and something being actioned on it for all of them. And so all of those VE issues that Andy was talking about earlier are less likely to hit us further on in the design process. And here's the sort of sustainable project management. How do we get that risk register into the normal design process or REBA stages? And what points do we start to collaborate with, say, the forestry people or the timber suppliers or the insurers, and making sure that that's set out in a strategic way. And so I'm just that's a sort of roundup of what is in our Phoenix playbook. But I wanted to tell another quick story as well, something that was sort of going on in parallel at Whitby Wood at the same time. And so back in 2020, we just wanted to really think as a small to medium engineering company, how can we plot our route to zero? And we want to do it by 2035. Like, how can we do it? And we really realized that the only way we can, we can't, as a small to medium consultant, we've got zero way of controlling it. And so we made this little interactive tool where you can kind of go in, it's on our website, and you can play with when different top technological advancements come into play and see how it affects our route to zero. You can see there in the green line, if no technological advancements happen, what is our expected trajectory? Is not to change that much really, and then all of a sudden just before 2035 we drop, and that's because we stop working on certain types of project, because it's the only way we can get to 2035. But is that a responsible thing to do in our industry? Is that helping the whole industry? No, it's just kind of burying our heads in the sand, to be honest. So we started on a whole program of getting out there, sharing knowledge, talks like today, leading discussions, teaching at universities, lobbying at COPs, really, and a lot of that is focused around timber, because what we found from that drop in the graph, the only way we could do it would be to only ever work on refurbishment projects or projects made from materials that can either be grown back or are reused from other buildings. So we've really started agendas in those areas. So we're really looking at reuse, refurbishment, and bio-based solutions. And we got involved with a consortium called UK Fires, nothing to do with fire. RE means resource efficiency, headed up by University of Cambridge. All the organisations involved are on the left. And we're looking at how do we get how do we find business opportunity in the absolute zero band there, because they found through an in-depth piece of research that all of the COP26 policy space relies on non-emitting electricity, which isn't necessarily possible at that scale, or carbon capture and storage, which almost definitely isn't possible at the scale they need. And so how do we find business opportunity in being within that purple bar at the bottom? And so we sponsored a PhD, which is Charlotte Taylor is halfway through at the moment, and she's worked with the University of Bath. And we set her the question, what can you build from the zero carbon resource pool? So she's looking at materials diets, looking back from the naturals age through the industrial age, through what we've just come out of, we think, the waste age, and into the post-carbon age, and really like looking around the country for what is our diet in the UK of zero carbon materials. And she's looking at them, perhaps in some of them being in the technosphere, so they're reused or recycled materials, some of them being in the biosphere, so they're natural, regrowable, renewable materials. And then where are they in the country? And therefore in 2050, when we're not allowed to emit any carbon, what we're going to be able to build in which parts of the country and at what scale. So it's super exciting. And then we've been sort of trying to incorporate this into the next development of the playbook. And so we're looking at our materials diet. If we go back to that triangle I showed earlier with the reuse materials, lean design specification, our materials diets in those top two triangles. And when we look at a site, like how do we approach it now? Like should we be looking at just assuming what the material should be, or will it be local to that site? Every single site will have a different low carbon solution that is appropriate. And so we've already started rolling out a couple of these reports now. So looking at master plans before any design has been done, understanding the typologies of residential, etc., that is needed, and then looking at all of the low carbon materials that are available in the proximity. We then also, through our UK fires contacts, have quite a lot of materials data on what is used in various different types of construction. So we've been really drilling into housing and looking at mid-terrace and detached housing. We've applied our own script to some of their data to find out where is the most embodied carbon spent in a typical house of that type. And there we can really hone in on, and we understand that the majority of carbon is spent in concrete in foundations and in blockwork in walls. And so we can hone in on those areas and really try and reduce them. So this is a sort of an example of one of the materials diets that we've come up with recently for a site in the east of England, and with the least impact at the top and slightly larger impacts at the bottom. And then really, like, we honed in on different types of floor systems, looking at it. The grey bars here are looking at the embodied carbon, so the emitted carbon through material production, and the orange bars are sequestered carbon stored in any natural materials used in the build. So we've been looking at the average house on the left-hand side, and then if you're building that out of CLT, it might spend a bit more embodied carbon, but you sequester quite a lot. But perhaps that's not very efficient with our material use, and maybe that CLT should be used somewhere else. Looking at posi joist, steel and timber composites, looking at stone, looking at I joists and straw bale construction, and seeing which really is the most appropriate for that site. Because the transport will also be included in those figures. And then also the same with walls, whether it's hempcrete, bamboo, again, rammed earth, perhaps straw bale, and coming up with recommendations based on that. But then also looking at what is the business opportunity in that is the key thing. So looking at all the local businesses local to the site, to see what can potentially match up to deliver the lowest carbon solution that you've identified for the particular buildings required and location. And perhaps that will then, speaking to investors, can encourage them to invest in the right way in that local area and create employment opportunity and create much more social benefit as well. And this is an example from abroad where we did a competition in the Far East, and they were doing a huge master plan extension to a city, and there was lots of existing buildings on the site already. So we were identifying those that will be retained as they are, those that could be retained and extended, and those that would for dismantling. We had a lot of agricultural land, so there's bio-based opportunities with an agricultural university as well, so to tie those up. Lots of manufacturing opportunities, so to tie that up with some of the dismantled materials, we could create a really good materials diet in the same way as the other playbooks. And And so this is something an approach to projects that we'd really like to start making on many more now. And we think it's much more regenerative and social, has more of a social impact as well. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, super impressive. I don't know why my camera's not showing. Oh, it is now. Thank you. What a timeline. If I want to move to Lewes, when can I move in?
So we're expecting to be starting on site in the new year, but we probably won't start the first actual buildings until the summer.
Yep.
The end of the summer, autumn probably. He says with his optimistic hat on. And so the first buildings will be ready the year after that, I suppose.
Okay, cool. And then, I mean, we had Ian Pritchett on from Greencore a while back. Actually, he was talking about his Spring Meadows case study, and that was impressive. But obviously, you guys have, well, gone one step further, two steps further in terms of how you're looking to achieve and the obstinate, not sure if that's the right attitude, but in terms of, we'll build it this way or not at all. It's unlike any other developer that I've ever been aware of. I know there's an architects on the calls that would probably be gagging to work with someone like you, because they're always sort of pushing upstream when it comes to trying to influence the client, as it were, or the developer. So is there a certain scale at which this works? Can you see, I mean, you talk about, the place making, but is there a minimum size, minimum number of houses that something like this would work for?
Yeah, I think the trick is that the smaller you go, the less impact you have generally on wider things outside of the building.
Yeah.
The bigger the place, the more impact you can have on the other stuff.
Yeah.
So there isn't a kind of absolute cutoff, but there's a sort of sliding scale of influence versus impact versus the various things. So, but one of the things that we're hoping is that so for instance, with the energy strategy, or with the co-mobility services, or with the estate management, because that's another big part of what we're doing, is we're setting up an estate management company so that we can be involved in the long term in the project and not just kind of fit and forget.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those kind of elements I just mentioned, we're setting up as ventures so that we can transfer that process to another site without having to reinvent things every time. Obviously, it will be very much tailored to that place.
Yeah.
But the thinking and the process and the background and the learning will all have been done, and so that should make it much more applicable, which we hope would allow the wider application of more of those levers of change to smaller projects, because the kind of hard yards have been done on a big project that can swallow that kind of investment time.
Yeah.
Time.
No, that makes sense. And I know we were talking before about how many more projects you have in the pipeline and the partners on board, and we'll be watching this space with interest. I mean, I appreciate, the hard work's only just starting, really. You've obviously gone over a massive obstacle with planning being granted, but you'll be deliver on this thing and stay true to your word. And I mean, the other thing as well, we've had previous, sometimes I get a bit, not down is the wrong word, but sometimes we do many of these webinars and topics. Sometimes it gets a bit idealistic. Even the session last week with Duncan and Samita was, we went off into sort of the realms of, I will just, there's not an attitude of hope and expectation, but the world is not built on hope. But equally, I think you guys have shown that, the issues of warranties and insurance, massive problem, but you've addressed it by bringing them in so early. And then were there certain partners and stakeholders that made the process more difficult? I'm assuming the insurance guys weren't just like ready to embrace anything you say. I mean, it must have been a flipping hard work.
No, I mean, no, so the insurance, for instance, the insurance have been quite helpful, actually, because they want to be involved as early as possible. And if you do involve them as early as possible, they want to help.
Yeah.
They want you to buy their insurance, right? They want
Of course.
to pay their premiums.
Yeah.
And with a lot of these things, you know, they're difficult, but you've just got to be bloody minded. You've got to just kind of, you know, we've just got to find a way.
Yeah.
Some of these things, there's no, you know, what's the alternative? We find a way, or we sell the site to Barratt Homes.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, or yeah, so what do you do? And the thing that that we've also kind of that we also keep to the forefront of our mind is that you've got to just do it. You know, there's like you say, there's a lot of people that talk a good game and talk about this and that. You just got to get on with it and actually do something.
Yeah. No.
I think that's really, really true. And I think just picking up on Andy's insurance point, I've been doing quite a lot. I'm also on the board of directors at Timber Development UK, and I've been working with the ASBP and Built by Nature a little. And we've been doing a lot of work within insurers. And the big thing that I've learned from the last sort of year and a half talking to them is we're actually quite often want the same things. We just talk a really different language and approach it from a really different way. And so the ASBP and Built by Nature published the Mass Timber Insurance Playbook, which is very much about mass timber, but sort of a lot of the principles are very similar, which really helps. It's free to download. It's worth having a read through because it really helps explain the best way to get the communication right between the two parties.
Yeah. Cool, marvelous. Right, thanks, guys. I think we've run out of time now, so I'll let you get back to your day jobs. Really appreciate it. You know, as I said, I can't be more complimentary. It's been amazing. I'll upload the video, try and get as many people to watch it as possible because it was a cracking case study of how things can be done going forward. So, I thank both for your time. Thanks everyone for joining, and I'll see you soon. Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.